of For Is a Coffee, which supports women farmers who grow coffee sustainably and celebrates women athletes in diversity in sport. And if you've been to a happy hour before, you perhaps hopefully have met Dr. Lisa Ingarfield. She's one of the co-founders of the Outspoken Summit, as well as the co-owner of Shift Sports. Her work focuses on how inclusion and exclusion manifest in communication practices. Through her participation in triathlon as an age grouper and as a coach, Lisa has realized how much her research applied to gender equity problems within the sport. She races triathlon regularly and owns Try to Defy Coaching, which provides run and triathlon coaching to women of all abilities. In addition to her work with the Outspoken Summit, she provides research and evaluation consulting services for criminal justice and advocacy agencies in the areas of ending interpersonal violence. Lisa originally hails from the UK, but currently resides in Colorado. So welcome, Gabby and Lisa. Thank you so much for being here to have this very important discussion with us. We're very happy and honored to have you today. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gabby. I'm really looking forward to jumping into the cold water and swimming with you all, because that's what we do. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Outspoken and the Live Feisty team for inviting me to participate tonight. I'm currently working on a book called Racing Triathlon with Dr. Ingarfield. Both Lisa and I have been thinking about diversity in triathlon from different perspectives. So I'm just really grateful to be here and to be part of this event. I'd like to begin by asking you to please fill out a couple of polls that are going to show up on your screen. These polls are completely anonymous. You can pick more than one answer. Maybe you want to pick, maybe you would pick all of them, but just pick whatever answers are resonating with you at this moment. As you're doing that, I'm going to begin by explaining my reason for participating today. I want to begin with a few words about who I am and what I aim to offer today. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm an age group triathlete, I'm a mom, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a professor. I also want to emphasize that I am human. I'm always telling my students we are humans first and scholars second. And in this case, we are humans first and triathletes second. I am part of the system of white supremacy and colonialism. I do not have all the answers. I have my own biases. And I've been managing my own emotional roller coaster most of my adult life as a student and professor of ethnic studies, as a Latina in academia. I've also felt especially triggered in the past couple of weeks as I read social media posts, as I read and watch the news. I identify as a woman of color. I do not identify as white. However, I'm a relatively light-skinned Latina, and my skin color does afford me privilege within the system of white supremacy. I also enjoy a lot of other kinds of privileges. I'm always learning how to be an effective ally without being condescending and patronizing, and I often fail at that goal. But if I've learned anything from triathlon, it's to honor the process and keep showing up, despite the challenges, the pain, and the failures. I'm here today with three main goals. The first might sound cheesy, but the first is to continue learning. The second is to introduce a couple of frameworks that can help us navigate racism in triathlon and our role in that system. Finally, I hope these frameworks help us feel empowered in the fight against the main roots of racism. The reason why I searched for frameworks is to help us avoid or overcome some pitfalls and problems that I'm seeing in our community. So I want to talk about those briefly. The first is silence. Secondly, there is systemic and social silencing of Black women's voices through the literal erasure of Black experiences and ideas. 3, there are ongoing attempts to regulate Black people's actions, comments, and voices. And I'm seeing this especially play out on an insistence on civility and an insistence on kindness, but it's happening in other ways too. 4, it's a problem to expect or to ask Black people to offer education without offering compensation. 5, it's a problem to make a statement, any kind of statement, without being open to frank response or to erasing those responses without respecting the time and effort that goes into that response. 6, I think we're missing a common language to discuss race in our sport, including a shared understanding of definitions and important concepts when we discuss race. 7, many of us are operating in silos and quickly trying to enact change without communicating with one another and without learning from other groups and social movements that provide valuable lessons in activism and organizing on behalf of Black athletes. 8, we want to avoid unintentionally appropriating and watering down the branding, imagery, and platforms of important social movements that have been organizing on behalf of Black people at the grassroots level for years. 9, we want to avoid performative allyship. 10, I think we need to be very careful to avoid tokenization, such as the formation of diversity groups or diversity trainings without the careful thinking about leadership, goals, and positions of power and policies within the larger organization in which those groups are being organized. 11, we need to move beyond the attractive discourse of loving everyone as a solution for social justice. Loving and caring for everyone is a component of social change, absolutely. However, it does not get to the root of the problem, which is white supremacy and racist laws and policies. There are other problems that Lisa and I will continue to think about and work out in our book, but, and we're also very interested in solutions and in change. I'd now like to jump into introducing a few of the core principles of the first framework. And it's one I'm sure you've been hearing about in the news, and it's called anti-racism. I'm learning about this framework, and the ideas I share with you today come primarily from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was published in August of 2019. Kendi is a best-selling author. He's a professor of African American history and international relations. Beginning July 1st, Kendi will be the founding director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University in Washington, D.C., and he will also be the Francis B. Cation Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. In his book, Kendi argues that it's not enough to be not racist. The problem with being not racist is that it's a claim that signifies neutrality. To say, I am not racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism, is a claim to a neutral stance. But claims of not racist or colorblindness are a problem because the individual who claims colorblindness fails to see race, fails to see racism, and therefore falls into racist passivity. The position of not racist suggests that racial problems are rooted in group people. And because the focus is on groups of people, rather than focusing on the problem of power and policies, the position of not racist allows racial inequities to continue. Kendi suggests that there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. Therefore, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. So what anti-racism does is it endorses racial equality. It locates the roots of problems in power and policies. It confronts racial inequities. And it also means standing ready to fight at racism's intersections with other bigotries related to sexuality, class, gender, ableisms, etc. The position of not racist, the neutral position, endorses the idea of a racial hierarchy. It suggests that problems are rooted in groups of people, and it allows racial inequities to persevere. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. And Kendi says that this may seem harsh, but it's important at the outset that we apply one of the core principles of anti-racism, which is to return the word racist itself back to its proper usage. I like to go on a handout that I've prepared because I want to go over some of these really foundational definitions. So hopefully you can see this handout. I'm going to read it out loud. If you can't see it too clearly, I'll read it. I begin with two quotes from Kendi's book that I think are really important for us to keep in mind. The first says, definitions anchor us in principles. This is not a light point. If we don't do the basic work of defining the kind of people we want to be in a language that is stable and consistent, we can't work towards stable, consistent goals. The second is, the good news is that racist and anti-racist are not fixed identities. We can be racist one minute and anti-racist the next. What we say about race, what we do about race, each moment determines what, not who we are. So the rest of this handout is looking at these foundational definitions of racism to help give us that common language. The first is racist, one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction or expressing a racist idea. The second, anti-racist, one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Racism is the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Policy, and the definition for policy, I find, is the most useful for us. So the definition of policy is written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. Kendi argues that there is no such thing as non-racist or race-neutral policy. Every policy in every institution, community, in every nation is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity between racial groups. So what is racial inequity? And that is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So one example I pulled from triathlon is the demographics, and this is coming out of the USAT membership survey report. 0.458% American Indian or Native Alaskan, 1% African American, 2.84% Asian, 5.19% Latino, 86.48% white. As far as I know, Ironman doesn't gather demographic information, but if that's incorrect, if you have access to the information, please tell me, please share that with me. I'd really appreciate it. So racial equity, on the other hand, would be when two or more racial groups are standing on relatively equal footing. And I want you to start thinking about what would be an example of racial equity in triathlon, whether that is racist policy, any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. Other terms have been used to describe racist policy, such as institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. An example of that would be the Women for Tri Facebook page policy that said, quote, "This is not the forum to hash out controversial political/social issues. These posts will be removed," which subsequently led to the erasure and silencing of Black voices and meaningful discussions about racism in triathlon. Anti-racist policy would be any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. And again, I would love for you to start thinking about what would be an example of anti-racist policy in triathlon, whether that exists or not. Anti-racism can be real if we focus on power instead of people, if we focus on changing policy groups of people. It's possible if we overcome our cynicism about the permanence of racism. So if we're going to focus on policies and power rather than on groups of people, how in the heck do we do that? Part of the strategy today is to start talking about that in small groups and then in a larger group. But before we get to that, I want to offer a second framework by educator and activist Deepa Iyer to help us think about how we can be most effective. It's called My Role in the Social Change Ecosystem. Iyer developed this helpful image. Just want to make sure you see the whole image. She developed this helpful image, which you can see here on the handout. Iyer developed this framework as a three-step process. First, you identify your values and context in the middle circle. Second, you map out your roles and played by your ecosystem. And third, you reflect, observe, and plan. Now, Iyer makes sure to say that you can edit this based on your community's values and the roles you play, but I think that this is a great place for us to start. Based on Iyer's image here, our values would be equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity. And Iyer provides a variety of roles we all play in our ecosystem or our community. As you look at these different roles, I'm going to go ahead and read you a description. Some of us are frontline responders who quickly and ably transition into rapid response mode instinctively and organize resources, networks, and messages. Some of us are healers who tend to the individual and intergenerational traumas of white supremacy, racism, colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and nativism. Some of us are storytellers and artists, binding the past to the present, channeling the histories and experiences of our ancestors to shed light on what is possible today. Some of us are natural bridge builders who can work across divisions with patience and compassion. Some of us are proud disruptors who speak up and take action, especially comfortable and risky. Some of us are caregivers who provide nourishment to organizers, exude concern and love, and create a community of care. Some of us are visionaries, ability to find, articulate, and reconnect us to our North Star, even when we cannot clearly see the sky. And other of us are builders who are actively developing the ideas, the structures, and the scaffolding for our organizations and movements. Not all of us can or should play each of these roles. We might also find ourselves falling into different roles depending on personal and external circumstances. Or we might be observers and supporters from the side from time to time. An effective, healthy, and sustainable social change ecosystem requires different actors to play these roles, and often at different times. I recommend that you look up Iyer and her work because she provides really helpful guiding questions that accompany this infographic. But for the purposes of today's happy hour, we're focusing on some specific questions to help us make connections between these two frameworks and triathlon. Ultimately, I'm hoping that we can shift the question of how can we help in the struggle against racism to how can I enact anti-racist policy and power in triathlon. With that, I'd like to yield the Zoom box to Lisa, who will explain the next part of this workshop.
Thank you so much, Gabby. That was amazing. I couldn't write fast enough to get it all down. So as Gabby shared, we're going to break you into small groups so that you can discuss some questions. But before I explain that process, I just wanted to take a moment to remember that today is actually the 5-year anniversary of the mass shooting that happened in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, at the Mother Emanuel Church, where 9 African-American parishioners were shot down by a white supremacist. And so I think that it's important for us to remember that that happened, for us to spend some time thinking about those victims and their families, and also to understand that what we're talking about here today is an issue that has persisted for generations, right? And it's manifested in different ways, certainly. But this is something that is an ever-present experience for folks of color in our triathlon community. And so we should be mindful of that as we think about answering the questions that we're gonna have you answer in the breakout sessions. So we are dropping into the chat box. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should have a little chat icon. And so the 3 questions that we want you to answer in your breakout groups will be dropped in there. What I would say also is that we will not be recording you in your breakout groups, right? So this main group session here is being recorded, but what you talk about in your breakout sessions will not be recorded. We're just going to randomly split you into groups. It's going to bump you into these groups. So take a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves and then work through the questions. There'll be 20 minutes, give or take, for you to have a discussion, and then we'll come back together. The system will bump you out, but we will also give you a 5-minute warning that that's happening. And then we'll come back together and we'll have, as best as we can on Zoom, a large group discussion about the things that you talked about. Now, don't feel like you have to respond in the large group after the small sessions for your group. We're not asking you to come to any consensus. We really just want you to share some ideas and think about the questions and start to tackle some of these harder things that we're asking in terms of making sustainable change and maintaining an anti-racist position in triathlon. So with that, I think that was all of my questions. Did I miss anything? Gabby, Ellen, Lindsay, Sarah? Nope. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and put you at random into breakout groups. So that should happen and you'll just be bumped into them. So.
All right. Yeah, I actually is back now.
All right. Great. Welcome back, everyone. There was a question before the breakouts about the handout that Gabby had created. And yes, we can get that to you. So we will either, are we emailing it? What was the decision on that? Anyone who wants? Sarah?
Lindsay?
What?
I'll answer. I think we'll email. We can put it in the Facebook group. We have a Facebook group for the happy hours. And we will email. We will send the handout in an email. So if you signed up, you had to sign up by email to get this link, so you will get it.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, I know it sounds like you are all having pretty great discussions. And so we really appreciate you engaging in that and having that opportunity for small group discussions. It's much easier, I think, when there's less people for folks who prefer more intimate arenas for this kind of conversation. So now we're going to have kind of bring everyone back in and talk about the things that you talked about for the next 20 minutes or so. So this section is going to be recorded, right? So if you share, that will be recorded. If you don't want your video on the recording, then, turn off your camera. And then what we're going to do is if you click on the participants tab at the bottom of the page, it will pop up. It should theoretically pop up on the right-hand side, like a white box that has all of your names in it. And then on the bottom right-hand side, there should be a little option to raise hand. And so I'm just gonna, we're gonna go question by question and just have people raise their hand, and then it should indicate to me that you're raising your hand, and then I'll unmute you to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts. Don't feel like you have to share your thoughts about what your group talked about. You do not have to be like the representative of your group. Share your thoughts for yourself and any aha moments or ideas that you had based on the questions. And then I will say there is 80 or so of you, and it would be really great to hear from as many people as possible who want to share. And so just be mindful of that when you're providing feedback and thoughts, that you are recognizing that there might be like 17 people behind you that also want to say something too. I think that's everything I wanted to say. Yeah, okay, so we'll go question by question. So we'll start with the first question. So we would love to hear back from folks about what they discussed and what their thoughts were on where you see yourselves fitting into the social change ecosystem. So if you have something you want to share in relation to that question, raise your hand, and hopefully I will see you doing that. Oh, okay. All right, hang on, Melanie. Unmute. All right, you should be good to go, Melanie.
I'm not going to say where I kind of fit with that, but I think what was interesting with everyone is everybody had great descriptions on where they fit in that system. So I think all of us do have a sense of where we're at right now, which is a great place to be starting from. even if we don't know that we fit in any of those circles, we at least know where we're currently at. I think that's great momentum to start from.
Great. So it sounds like everyone was on the same page, kind of had an understanding of where they needed to go from, their starting point.
Where they were, how they could help, how they fit multiple. So everybody had great descriptions. They had a clear sense of who they are and where they're at. So that was pretty interesting to hear.
Cool. Thanks, Melanie, for sharing that. Okay. So now I think, Melanie, you need to lower your hand. I think there's an option to do that. Okay. So Anne, I see Anne. Hang on, Anne. All right, Anne, you were unmuted.
Hi. Well, we had a number of people in our group that felt that they fell into the storyteller role, like people who either work in communication fields or had like facility in writing and communicating. So we had some strength there in our group.
Okay, that's awesome. So thinking about what kind of stories are being told, right? And how that can perpetuate unequal systems. Awesome. Thank you, Anne, for sharing that. All right, we have, okay, M, I think, because your name is your first and last name together. So let me unmute you. Oh, did I lose you?
Oh, I think I muted myself. That's okay?
Yes. No, yeah. You're good. Go ahead.
So I was thinking like my personal role, like is something that's like a little closer to me, is like I work as a swim coach for like a pre-club group. Like they're pretty young. Some kids haven't really seen the water before they come to me. I love working with them, but I noticed like the demographic there as well is largely it's all white. I haven't ever coached a person of a kid of color. And so what you're talking about in our group is you like swimming especially, but then in bikes especially too, is just like creating accessibility for like from the ground up and like changing the demographics like in our swim clubs. Because I think about the swim clubs that I see like at the training center that I'm at, and I don't see any Black swimmers there. And I think like in my role as like a swim coach, and like I want to be a coach going forward, is like reaching out and working, like actively working to like change that demographic like from a young age.
Mm-hmm. Right. So rather than just accepting kind of the status quo, like that's just the way it is, right? Being active in your pursuit of equality, racial equality as it relates to your role as a coach. Great. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to share anything on that first question? Where do you see yourself fitting into the social change ecosystem? All right, Kelly, hang on one second. All right, Kelly, you should be good to go.
So there were a couple of us in our group that actually didn't know exactly where we would fit in the ecosystem, and part of it was that the first time we've actually seen that circle, but definitely feel like I'd like to learn more about that. Looking through all of them, one of the members thought that they would be a storyteller. I don't know that I feel like I'm a storyteller. Some felt like disruptors. I could be a disruptor sometimes, but I wouldn't say that would be the thing that I am. So I guess I don't know yet, and I don't really know what to do with that yet, but I don't know.
I think that's okay to not know. And I would also suggest that you probably can change roles, right? I mean, I don't think a fixed identity that if you fall into the disruptor that you 100% of the time have to always be the disruptor, because that can be extraordinarily tiring. So, you need to step forward and step back. So I think that's it's a good observation to be thinking about where you fit.
Sure.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks.
Anyone else have any comments on the first question? All right. I will move on to the next one. So the second question we all had you look at was, how does the framework of anti-racism that Gabby had outlined relate to triathlon? So what kinds of things did you come up with there? How did you see those connections? Okay, Anne, hang on 1 second. All right. Oh, no, hang on.
There we go.
There we go. Go ahead, Anne.
Well, we talked about the whole idea of policy and so on, and how if you're going to have change there has to be changes at the top of the organizations that administer the sport. And somebody made a very good point about how it's been very disappointing that Ironman has been silent on this issue, very much so lately. And so we talked about the difference between making change at that level and making change at the grassroots level, and how at some point, even if we start to make changes at the grassroots level, you have to break through those at some point you're going to hit that organizational threshold where you won't be able to make the change unless the people who administer the sport are willing to go there.
Yeah, it definitely needs to happen on all levels for sure. And if you don't have buy-in from the top, from leadership at the top, then certainly some efforts can be thwarted. That's definitely true. Thank you, Anne. Appreciate that. Okay, we have Jordan up next. Hang on, Jordan. All right, you should. No, you're not. Gosh, what's happening? Okay. No.
I have to also unmute too. So.
Oh, okay.
It's a technical thing. I guess I'm going to echo to some extent what Anne said, but it's the idea that we shouldn't have to wait for people of color or for people in minority situations to ask. Like there should be a broader policy and a greater effort at the top level to like, hey, how do we foster greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not wait for like the person of, and we use an example of like, hey, I'm white, I have super fine hair, every swim cap fits me, but what if I have braids and beautiful long tresses? Like swim caps may not fit me. Like there's small things, or whether it's a changing room for someone who's Muslim, like you should not have to wait for that person of minority to ask to be accommodated. You should make it more accommodating in the first place. That's just one example.
Yeah, and that reminds me of in disability studies, there's the concept of universal design for learning, right? That's applied to academic environments, but the same concept applies in sport, right? Like if you begin, so if you take that anti-racist stance, that universal design and everything from the ground up is structured that way, yes, then there wouldn't need to be a request for an accommodation. Yeah.
That sounds such a most sophisticated way of saying it.
Oh, you just made me think of it. Thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it. All right, Trinny, let me try and unmute you. Maybe you have to unmute yourself too. Perfect. Go ahead, Trinny.
Great. Now it's really loud up here, but and I really don't even remember the question, but all I wanted to say was that my mind was blown last October when I went to Kona and I met Sika, and she shared with me that her goal was to become the first female pro triathlete that was Black. I wasn't even aware that that was a thing. I mean, I just, I navigated obliviously thinking that there were Black pro triathletes that were female. And, I think it's very important for us to support one another. And well, I guess that was something that I shared with the group, and I wanted to share with you guys. I don't know if you guys were aware, but yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Trinny, because it comes back to, again, thinking about policies, right? So what policies are written neutrally, but actually around, becoming a professional triathlete, in what ways do they actually just kind of reinforce the status quo as opposed to actively engaging and thinking about how do we do a better job there? I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. All right, Clark, hang on. All right, Clark, you should be good to go.
Hi, everyone. I think even along the same lines as 50 Women to Kona, that the organizations have to accept more of a responsibility and inclusion of ethnicity and gender even. And until that's done, we've got a struggle that's ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thinking some accountability needs to really happen at the organizational level.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. All right, we have Kristen. Hang on, let me unmute you.
Yep. So I think just kind of continuing on this thread, it's not just about the compositional diversity, though. It's about the sharing of the power and relinquishing the control. Like that to me, as I look at the sport that is primarily controlled by these, and white men, in whether they're race directors or governing bodies or whatever, how do we demand for more diverse representation on those bodies in those race leadership positions? Because as long as, I've been thinking about this in the context of my workplace too, like as long as the board of directors is only nominally diverse, so like the white men in that boardroom still have 51% of the vote, are things really going to change? And so that's where we as the customers and the participants, I think, need to be demanding of those things, because if we had more folks of diversity in those positions, we would have already thought about the changing rooms and the swim caps to fit different people's hair, because those issues would have been brought up by the people who are experiencing those.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point there about it not just being about compositional diversity. I think that's sometimes where this conversation ends up leading, that it's really about the numbers, and it's so much more than that. We think about how power operates, and actually Ibram Kendi also says that the reason for racist policy and racist ideas is because of the pursuit of self-interest, right? And so that's actually where it originates. It doesn't, racism doesn't originate from ignorance or hate, I think is the two that he says, ignorance and hate. It actually originates from self-interest, because we enact a policy that serves our self-interest, and then we have to justify said policy with racist ideas. So, you could definitely apply that to Iron Man and the 50 Women to Kona, right? It's not a race example, but it's a sexist example, because the policy is proportional representation, or the policy is that there are unequal slots, and the sexist justification for that is that it's proportional, right? So you can trace that back to self-interest and then who's running, who's making those decisions. So I really do appreciate that, Kristen. That's a really important point. All right, we've got lots of people now. So let me go to Elizabeth.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so one of the things that I was thinking about as far as like club policies is that I know that here in the Bay Area, we do a lot of group rides in really wealthy white neighborhoods outside of San Francisco. We go across the bridges and ride over there. And my boyfriend is not Black, but he is a person of color. And he pointed out to me once while we were riding out there that he has to be really, really careful to make a full stop at every single stop sign, because the police will target him for ticketing, as opposed to groups of white triathletes who really just don't even think about this when we're out on group rides. And then I was thinking about rides that are drop rides, and thinking about dropping an athlete of color in one of these neighborhoods, and not even thinking about it because it's a drop ride, people are responsible for themselves, but thinking about how that might be a deterrent to other people wanting to go on these rides with us, knowing that we're going to be not thinking about their safety.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing that example. I think that you're right. Like, as a white cyclist, it's not something that's at the forefront of my mind, right? So, and your point about the drop versus no drop, and what that could mean for athletes of color, that's a really important point. Thank you. All right, Carla.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hey, well, I'm passionate about this subject because we've learned a lot here in the Bay Area, and it's so great to go right after one of my Women for Tri alumni, Elizabeth Snyder. We do a beginner program for women of all ages and abilities to come into the sport of triathlon. And what's been so exciting about that program, seeing someone like Elizabeth, who probably didn't think she could do a triathlon, go on to do an Ironman, is see the number of women that we've brought into the club. And guess what's happened? We now have a female president, we have a female vice president. The club actually is more females than males for, I think, the first time. So we've seen from just doing grassroots, you know, down in the trenches, good work to bring people that maybe didn't think they would be able to do triathlon, you know, to doing their first triathlon and going on to be a successful member of the club. So we're actively trying to do more for you know, women of color, and I would say just you know, underrepresented folks in the club. To hear Sika talk about going to Kona, and you and I had to talk about this, her having people look at her like, wow, what, you know, what is she doing here? You know, we have to do better. So I'm excited to see where this momentum goes.
Great. Thank you, Carla, for sharing what you're up to. That's really great for folks to hear. All right, Carly, I think. Oh, no. Oh, sorry. I think I just muted you by accident. Carly, there you go.
Hello. So I kind of had some interesting points of hearing everyone talk. So I actually used to work in the running industry. I worked for the LA Marathon for 5 years, left and work in something very different now. And just hearing everyone talk about leadership positions, and I completely agree that's always a lacking area, but a moment that really sprung to my mind was one time the marketing manager just sat next to me and said, hey, Carly, you know, how does this ad look to a woman? And just that simple transaction, if there's no diversity in any of these organizations on all levels, you know, if you don't have that coworker, you can say, and I don't right now at my company, hey, how do I approach this subject correctly so you don't do it? So I think it's kind of looking at it on all ends, and really thinking on the grassroots level is, you know, even working at the race I worked at, is you feel so big and it's a different mentality. And I think, unfortunately, Ironman has kind of become the representation of our whole sport. And I think sometimes we have to look at our grassroots, our local races, and that's where we can directly say, hey, you know, Black Girls Run and this is an amazing running club. Let's connect them to this triathlon, make a great program, and you help connect the pieces, and they'll be able to go a lot farther with it. I know they're a lot farther and there's less of them, but I think that's a way that really builds those grassroots foundation of the sport.
Yeah, there's Katie Peach in the group chat. Her microphone is not working, but she talked about a very similar thing to what you just shared. She said she thinks representation is an important factor, i.e. photos, media, stories, heroes, etc., for people to look to. It's hard to even imagine yourself doing something when you don't see anyone who looks like you doing the race, whether that's your racial identity, gender, ability, that sort of thing. So it's kind of similar to your story of a marketing person, right? And then the local level, I appreciate that, because we have to be working across all levels, right? So it isn't just about Ironman, right? It's about all of those levels of triathlon, federation, local races, where we need to be moving. So thank you, Carly.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a few more. I'll take like 4 more on this question, and then we'll move on to the last question. So Barbara, I have you next.
Hi, everybody. So just like after listening to Sarah and Sarah's podcast last Friday and hearing a little bit more about, you know, the Women for Tri board, and that we got all these women together and said, hey, we're going to get more women in the sport. And then they didn't actually give them power. And now Ironman's saying they're going to put this like diversity board together. And so not only just getting people of color to the table, but actually giving their voice power and meanings. is it important too, not just getting them there, but listening to their voice and it affecting actual change. I think is super important.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. That's really like Gabby's point around tokenizing, right? And you can have 1,000 diversity and inclusion committees, right? But if you do not enable said committees with power, because it always comes back to power, who has the power, then not a lot is going to change. So appreciate you pointing that out. All right, Karen. There you go.
Okay, thank you. What has occurred to me is that we've been talking about the power that's above what's the organizations that control and make decisions. And we in our group, we talked a lot about starting really young and getting the diversest group of kids involved in the sport and build that, because I think we have to have power at lower levels, massive power that's diverse and has an anti-racism awareness, and that will help move. It will look different and we'll have more power to change the power at the top. I think it has to work. What I'm trying to say is I think it has to happen at both, from the bottom up and from the top down, to really work. And that we really need to think about how to do that in a really positive way.
Yeah, and also thinking about, so, you know, as a white person, acknowledging that I benefit from these policies, right? These policies that are inherently racist because they are not anti-racist, right? And so what does that mean for me to give? I need to give something up. I need to be willing to give something up. And I think that's where sometimes we hit a roadblock, is folks at all levels, from the grassroots all the way to the top, right? Aren't necessarily willing to give something up. And so that's dense and hard and difficult. But you're right, Karen,
but
we need to start there.
Young, we can build a culture.
Right. Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm going to take Jess and Winston, and then I'm going to move to the next question. So Jess first. I'm like clearly not very good.
I'm good. I'm unmuted. I just wanted to highlight the piece you said about racism is not ignorant. And so if racism is not ignorant, then to me that means that education isn't enough. So like right now, in trying to figure out what people's different roles are, education has been pushed a lot, which I think is important now, but also like I think we'll need to make more of a business case for giving something up, like Lisa just mentioned too. It's not that people don't know, it's that people aren't willing to sacrifice.
Right, yes.
And myself included, because that sacrifice is scary too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a great point, right? It is more than education, because the education assumes that people don't really understand the dynamics of race in the United States, at least, and the origin of that is around power and the maintenance of power, right? I think there's more here. Obviously, we can't dive into that particular issue now, but that's definitely a great point for responding to that, Jess. Thank you. All right, so Winston, let me unmute you. All right.
I agree with kind of Karen's point where there has to be both viewpoints, from top down and bottom up. I was very fortunate to be a sports leader of an organization in triathlon. I'm a visible minority, and I think it was 2 years ago when I attended an annual general meeting, and my president, which is a female, said, "You're the only Chinese person or visible minority that is in the whole room." And I think that's something that is kind of an important point, is that when we look at diversity and policies, we're coming in from one perspective and we're not listening to kind of the bottom aspect and how it affects those individuals. And as a leader, sometimes is not at a forefront for us. Like, we do have diversity policy and inclusion policy, but we never take action. And I think we can create all the policy we want, but unless you enact a project or an action plan to enhance those policies, and there's accountability to your members that you reported it on an annual general at an AGM where you report your diversity numbers and kind of the trend from year to year, I think it's always going to be hidden at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's accountability is a huge piece of this, Winston. Thank you for bringing that up. And I definitely think that if policies are written without input, right, or like you said, of the folks who those policies impact, then they're not really anti-racist policies, right? They're not actively engaging in a process or a strategy to create racial equality, right? They're just policies sitting there that are just maintaining the status quo. So that feedback loop is really important in the accountability. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's move on to our last question, get some thoughts on that. So our last question is, what can you do as an individual or in groups to be actively anti-racist in triathlon? So that's that active piece, right? Not that neutrality and just kind of sitting back. What thoughts do people have on this? All right, Trinny. Okay.
Well, I mean, I've been listening to everybody, and I think the most important part is to include people that actually are directly affected, right? So the Black community has to be supported, and we have to be able to include those people in different positions, because no matter how hard we try, we will never understand what their needs are. And as part of a community that is trying to support other communities, I think we should all become one community. And in order to do that, like Karen said, and like Barbara said, I mean, there has to be positions and there has to be people involved in every level in order for that to kind of come together and create pieces of the puzzle to kind of connect. I mean, that's what I've been observing this whole entire time. And it's sad because I think some people that have the best intentions have gotten caught in the fire. And that's why people that really know what we should be supporting should be supported to be in those leadership positions. And
yeah, I think that the multi-layered approach that you're identifying and others have identified is very important. And I just want to comment on your intention piece. I think that it's very easy to get stuck on, well, my intentions were good, right? But we have to, as white people, as a white person, acknowledge that my intentions don't mean jack if I harm someone, right? And I need to acknowledge that harm, and I need to not sit in the harm and make it about me, and I need to move on, right? And I think that that's a struggle. That's really hard. It's not easy to do that, but I do think that we need to be able to acknowledge that harm, your intentions don't matter if harm has been done, right? And have a conversation about that. So thank you, Trinny. I appreciate your comment. All right, Lolita, let me unmute. Okay, great.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to ask something like, who thought of investing, Ironman says they're going to invest $1 million towards this diversity initiative they're setting up. But I did some initial research, and Ironman was just sold to a Chinese company for $650 million. So that equivalates to less than 1% towards their diversity initiative. So my question is where did they come up with that number? And why can't it be more money? Like, if you really want to make some change, I just think more money has to be invested than 1 million, especially if you earn that much. If you earned that much money or you were sold for that much money. It's just an opinion. So if I think that's one thing, say Ironman could be a little more anti-racist in that case, is just up the number. That's it, you know? So.
Yeah, thank you, Lolita. I don't have an answer for you about how they came up with that number, but certainly, Megan just posted some transparency about that. Yeah, how did they come to that number? And you're right, I think, and we see this a lot with very large companies who have amazing profits annually. They come out with some enormous figure to donate, but when you actually do the math, it's like 0.2% or something like that, right? And so I do think, to Lolita's point, that not accepting that that's sufficient, right? And continuing to push is certainly one way that we can enact anti-racist activity. Thanks. All right, Courtney, you're up next.
So related to the question, the third question that was asked about taking action, in our group, there was a lot of ideas that came up, but the aha moment that I had was that I get tripped up a lot when I think specifically about triathlon because of, where do we find a pool, and what if not everybody has a bike, and like I start kind of blowing up the problem because triathlon is complicated. But it occurred to me that we can, somebody in our group mentioned talking with kids and like kind of starting at that level. And at that level, it's super easy to talk about the experience of being a triathlon, and just everybody here has a story about why they did triathlon and how inspirational triathlon was to them and how it motivated them and built confidence. And I think just any kid hearing a story from any adult talking about building confidence through sport and meeting a community, and then putting that in the context of a triathlon story might inspire younger kids to say like, oh, what is this triathlon thing? And so, yeah, for me, the aha moment was like, it doesn't have to be about pools and bikes and money. It can be about an inspirational story about triathlon.
Right, believing in someone that they can do it. Yeah. Absolutely, because certainly someone's lack of ability, or rather perceived ability to do something, that is derived from a racist idea or an ableist idea, right? That just the assumption you can't, right? So great point, Courtney. All right, Taryn.
Ooh, I'm muted. So exciting. One thing I definitely want to do, I initially was very upset about Ironman's lack of response. And just wanted to completely boycott everything Ironman forever. And then I said, I'd rather be at the table, or at least part of the group, and see what's happening, and hopefully, put some accountability to what they're saying. So I signed up to join that group. Mm-hmm. I certainly hope that, I haven't heard anything yet, that was a few days ago, but hopefully it does move forward. And I just want to be someone, in the room to just say, hey, yeah, what is going on and where is this stuff going? And because that is a huge, organization that can go into these communities, talk to these kids, talk to just different places that aren't even aware what triathlon is, and just get the ideas percolating. Another idea that we talked about at the end of that first Outspoken was just inviting people, at your gym that maybe you're in like a Zumba class, and just say, hey, I'm going to go swim tomorrow. Do you want to come with me? Someone that is not, your usual swim partner. I think that's something that just getting the ideas out there and opening it up and talking about it. And that's something that, I definitely want to do, because it's very easy, I think, to get really frustrated with Ironman and say, what are they doing? What are they doing? And we need to actually just ask them, what are they doing? And do something with it. And then, get it out there if it's not happening. So that's my plan.
Right, and what's our responsibility in that, right? So rather than just complaining about Ironman and all of its potential downfalls, right, taking action and doing something about it. You make me think of this Audre Lorde quote, and it's not going to be exactly right, but she asks the question, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house, right? So thinking about Ironman or thinking about triathlon broadly, it's like, can the tools that exist within the sport dismantle it from the inside out? Or do you actually have to be on the outside and use different tools to dismantle it from the outside? And there's not I don't have a right answer to that, but kind of your point, Taryn, about you're joining the group, you're kind of going in the avenue of, well, I'm going to go in, right? And I'm going to start breaking it down from the inside, right? And I think that it's potentially a bit of both and maybe more than that, but it just made me think of that. So thanks for sharing. All right, Rachel, we'll have Rachel be our last comment and then we'll wrap up because we're at 7:30 Mountain Time. All right, go ahead, Rachel.
So what was actually brought up by I think Kevin in our group was that we need to step back because triathlon is part of society and say, what are the structural society inequities? And one of those is money. It's an expensive sport. And so if we want, you know, Black and brown people tend to be poorer people, and that's a structural inequity in our society. And money is a barrier to an expensive sport with capital expenses. And so if we want to open the sport to more people, supporting a living wage, a thriving wage for all people, right? A person doesn't have time for triathlon if they have to work 3 jobs, you know, and they can't afford a bike. So there's one thing of like, you know, letting someone borrow a bike or getting them a wetsuit in high school and sponsoring them, but how can we really back up and look at what does my society do when the average Ironman is a middle-aged white guy who makes $200,000? How do we change the financial demographic of our sport to assist, because like race and class are so intertwined, especially in the United States. So what as a citizen outside of triathlon can you do that will then feed into triathlon, because societal equity will feed in triathlon equity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciate it. That's actually a great point to finish on, because I think some of the struggles that we all have when thinking about how anti-racism and applies to triathlon is we are zoomed in on triathlon, right? And we actually need to do what you're suggesting, and we have to zoom out, because triathlon exists in a culture and a society. And so all of those racial inequitable structures that exist in our society affect triathlon, right? There's no dividing line between triathlon and the rest of society, right? Which is part of why the Women for Tri issue was so problematic, is because it was shutting down and denying that there's any overlap. And so I really appreciate that point. I think we all need to zoom out, right? And think about how does our culture, our society, and the rules and policies and capitalism feed into the inequities that we're seeing in triathlon. So I'm going to wrap up our discussion there. There's some chat going on, I think, and I'm going to hand back to Gabby. If you have some closing thoughts, or not, you don't have to, but.
I mean, everyone just gave so much useful feedback. I really appreciate the specific ideas, because this is where the work is really hard, and it's really hard not to have the answers, right? So I really hope that these frameworks are helpful, and I just really want to emphasize that I think they're helpful. I think anti-racism is helpful because it doesn't focus on groups of people. It asks us to really look at power, to really look at policies. And if we want to make change, that's where it needs to happen. And if policy is any unwritten or written rule or regulation, those things that are written and unwritten by which we live by, it's really tough work. So, I mean, like I said, I don't have any closing thoughts that will help wrap this up in a neat bow. And maybe that's what I want to leave with. This is not something that we can wrap up with a nice bow. This is like really hard work. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate all of your comments. It's helpful to think about these frameworks in relation to our sport.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that, or echo Gabby's point, that this is hard work, and there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into this, and to not retreat, right? It's very easy for, I'm going to speak for myself as a white person. It's very easy for me to retreat when things get hard, or I'm called out, or I do something that I feel bad about, because I don't have to live, like I don't have to live thinking about race every day, right? Because my racial identity is privileged in our society. And so I would just encourage all of the folks on the call today who identify as white, is that you have to stay in it, and you have to resist the urge to retreat, even when it doesn't feel great, because that's what it's going to take to sustain this effort over the long haul. We can't just let this fade and go about our business, because then we drop back into that neutral space, the non-racist but really racist space, right? Because we're not actively working for racial equality. So Ellen, Sarah, Lindsay, did you want to have any final thoughts?
Just thank you. Yeah, thank you both, Dr. Ingarfield and Dr. Nuñez, for joining us tonight. I think Lindsay will have the final remarks.
Yeah, well, I also wanted to thank everyone who joined us as well. And can we, just in the chat box maybe, can folks indicate if you would like to have another session and a further conversation too? Because that's something that I would certainly get behind. Yay. And thank you also to my team who, our team who like made this happen too. I always appreciate your work. So thank you, everyone.
All right, Lindsay, take us out.
Yeah, I thank you, Lisa and Gabby, for your time and your energy in this. As you said, Gabby, it's not an easy conversation. So, I just appreciate that you put the energy into putting this together for us. So thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who came and engaged. It can be uncomfortable, but these are our conversations that are so important. So thank you. And I'll share the handout that Gabby made for us on the Facebook group, and Ellen will email that out as well. So check in on those channels for that. I think that about wraps it up. Have a great night, everyone. And yeah, keep an eye on future discussions. We'll see what we can do to bring that to you.